Well, welcome to Flashback to a Fabulous Future. Today we have David Williams. He was a high school educator in the Fairfax County Public School System, and he has written a book that I'm sure he would love to tell you a little bit more about. So, David, why don't you tell us what prompted you to write the book? What is the title of the book and your background? And how did your background impact your decision to write this book?
Well, the title of the book is Surviving the Tri-Centennial Challenge, and it lays out what I see as a potential future for the country. Now, as far as my background goes, before I taught in Fairfax County Public Schools, I served 22 years with the Department of State in probably 6 or 8 different countries around the world. Many of them in countries that don't have nearly the freedom or the rights that we have. And before that, I was in the United States Air Force for 4 years and served in Vietnam. The thing that's prompted me to write the book, I see a lot of things where the United States, in my opinion, has veered off of the future that our founding fathers had envisioned for us. As a history major and a government teacher, I spent a lot of time researching the history of civilizations around the world, and I came to the conclusion that civilizations in general average about 300 years from the time that they're initially founded until the time that they either go out of existence or they become considerably less important society in the world than they started out, or when they reach their apex. And given that 300-year period, I started looking at the United States. Now, the United States, depending upon whether you look at our founding in 1776 as our Declaration of Independence, or 1787 when we did the Constitution, we are either at 236 years or 247 years. And it's at that point in most civilizations that have existed across time that they start to slide. They've hit their apex. They've become as important or as strong or influential as they can be. And then they start sliding off. And by the end of 300 years, they're gone one way or another. Now, that sequence is something that I discovered, and I read a lot of books about it, and there are different reasons why that happens. But none of them talked about the reasons that I really believe it happens. And I really believe it happens because over that period of 300 years from one generation to another, or ignores or modifies the founding ideas and principles that were created until at the end of that 300 years, they've totally lost the founding principles and the founding ideas. Now, as I mentioned in the first part of my book, there are things that look like exceptions to that. You talk about Chinese civilization lasting 3,000 years, or the Roman Empire, which lasted several centuries beyond that. But if you look at those civilizations and break them down, you discover, well, that each dynasty in the Chinese was somewhere around 300 years, some less, some more, but the average was 300 years. And then they would regenerate themselves. You look at Rome, and that can be broken down into several parts that are shorter than 300 years or a little bit longer, but the average turns out to be 300 years. So what does that say about the United States and where we are? Again, as I said, in my opinion, we've gotten off track. We've gotten really off track. The question I ask is, have we hit that spiral where we're going to spiral down and accelerate our demise? Or are we going to figure out what it is that we've done wrong and sort of reinvigorate the country, get back on track, get back to where the founders wanted us to be, hoped we would be, and I think in a lot of cases prayed we would be 250, 300 years away from the beginning. So now what prompted me to do that, to look at that and to write? Well, I've got 6 grandchildren. 2 of them are just about ready to graduate from high school. One of them is out of high school and struggling to get along in the world economy. The other ones are in grade school or middle school, and they're going to be the ones that are inheriting what we're leaving for them. And the fact that they could be inheriting something that the founders gave us is a very positive thing. the fact that they're inheriting something that we may leave for them that is not what the founders wanted, for me, that's a very scary prospect. The other thing is, I looked at the Chinese, and my background is in Chinese language, Chinese history. When I was in the military, I was involved with China on the intelligence side. The Chinese, what they did every 300 years or so was they reinvigorated because they went back to some principles that were there to begin with. The whole concept of a Confucian principle that the early Chinese government was founded on, they would come back to that. And they would reinvigorate these Confucian principles and start all over again. I think if we're going to survive as a country, we're going to have to go back and look at what the founders gave us and try and reestablish the founding principles, the founding ideas that they gave us. And so the rest of the book, basically, each different section attacks or brings out the things that I think they gave us and what we've managed to do with it, either good or bad, since the beginning of the country. And my hope is that people will take a look at it and say, yeah, we've got to really fix this or we're in trouble. The next generation is facing a real impasse. And if we look at our economy today, if we look at some of the institutions that we were given when the founders put us together, if we look at the values and the principles that they believed in and that they formed the government around, if we don't go back to those, I believe we're in trouble.
Okay, I have a couple questions. First of all, at a really high level, what are some of the gaps that you see between what the founding fathers, what you believe the founding fathers envisioned, and where we're at today? And also, I'm totally on board with you, but I grew up in the 70s in particular, and I've been hearing since then, that, we're not going to be able to pass this on to our next generation. And yet somehow we keep managing to do so on some level. And I think a lot of people believe that because, especially in their own personal circumstances, they're still, and I use air quotes here, free, and we haven't devolved into a third world country, or we haven't, our civilization hasn't been decimated and destroyed, that, we're still fine. Being, like I said, a product of the 70s, I always find it interesting that there's all these what we call dire predictions. I remember that population was a huge issue in the 70s, and people had to quit having children because there wasn't going to be enough food by, I don't know, the next 10 years. And then there was the first time I'd ever heard El Nino, and all these weather patterns were going to destroy us, by the mid 1980s, the late 1980s. And then, of course, we hear now that climate change is going to destroy us. And, so I honestly believe that a lot of people have started to tune out, especially people that have lived through all of these different things, and just say, I'm so tired of hearing, this fear-based approach, and I'm not going to listen anymore because we're all still here. Everything seems to be fine. I still live in a nice house. I can pay my bills. I can do pretty much what I want, so it hasn't affected me. So I don't know. What would your thoughts on those types of things be?
My initial reaction to that is the frog in the pot. And I don't know whether you're familiar with that story or not. I'm sure you are. But basically, you put a frog in cold water, and then you start to heat it up. And the frog is just going to swim around in the cold water until it starts to boil, and it's going to kill it. If you dump a frog into hot water, he jumps out. I don't want to be too negative on this, because I think we've got a chance that we can sort of straighten things out. But at the same time, if you look at some of the things that were given to us and where we stand now, and the second section of my book, part 2 of my book, talks about 3 institutions. It talks about religion, it talks about the family, and it talks about education. On the religious front, regardless of what anybody says, we were founded as a Christian nation. And we put a lot of stock, or our founders put a lot of stock, in the Judeo-Christian background, okay? For the most part, during the founding period, and even up into the early 1800s, we had a very, very strong Christian bent in our country. The families went to church on Sunday. We didn't open the stores or anything on Sunday, so they did so at quite a cost. I mean, a lot of the countryside, they had to go several miles from their home to get to the nearest church on Sunday morning, and they did that by horseback or by carriage or whatever. Today, and I go through a lot of the statistics in the book, somewhere around 25% of the population talks about a real strong belief in God and in the Christian principles that we were handed to by the founders. The whole idea of church, on the one hand, people have backed off from church because now there's more and more stuff to do. There's more things that get in the way. But I also believe that there's been a subtle attack on Christian values and Christian faith in this country. And one of the things that you can look at is David Horowitz's book, Dark Agenda, and it talks about the attacks on the Christian faith across the board. The second thing is the family, partly because of their Christian beliefs and because of the Judeo-Christian foundation that they were built on. When the country was founded, it was founded upon the idea that there was a strong family, not just a core family of mother, father, and kids, but an extended family with grandparents being around to help with role modeling and everything else. And again, if you look at what we have today, the number of unwed mothers that are parents is astronomical. And without a father in the picture, it's very, very difficult for children. I'm convinced that a lot of the studies that have been done that talk about why particularly young males are involved in crime is because they don't have a good father figure in their lives to give them a role model that says, okay, you work for an education and so on. And then as far as our education is concerned, people back in the founding period were pretty much self-educated. If the parents had money, they would hire a tutor. Otherwise, the children had to learn to read and write from their parents. And because they had strong family or extended family, they were able to do that. And the things that they studied were a lot different than the things that we study today. They studied ancient Greece. They studied the republics of the ancient world and a lot of ancient history. And we were fortunate that we came into being as a country right after the Enlightenment. But there was an awful lot of great writings out there by people like Montesquieu and Locke and Hobbes and a whole variety of other folks that our founding fathers studied and took to heart and learned from. And we don't do any of that today. We don't have that in our schools, nor do we teach good civic education as far as the founding of our country and the Constitution and the different things that we've gone through in our history. So that being said, I think that we can change those things. I think that we can remodel our country to strengthen the church and strengthen the family and to improve our education. But it's going to take a concerted effort on the part of not so much my generation, because I'm getting to the end of mine, but my kids and hopefully their kids will get some inkling and be able to rework the country and get it back to where it was or where it should be. Whether that makes a lot of sense or not. It makes sense to me, and that's one of the reasons that I wrote the book. The other thing I want to mention about the book is it's not long. If you look at the font, it's 1.5 font print widths. It's only 132 pages long, and probably 6 pages of that is footnotes. So it's not a long book. And the reason that I made it short, the reason that I didn't go into extensive detail, which I could have on several subjects, is because young people today are not going to pick up a book that's 2 inches thick and start to read it, because that's not where they're at. But maybe a book that's only a 1/2 inch thick, they'll read. Hopefully they'll read it and take stock of some of the things that I've said and work to change things.
Yeah, I agree. I have found, and that's my whole flashback to a fabulous future, we stay pretty high level when it comes to history, because I have found that most people, even us adults, really don't know history very well. And we don't understand, you were in my Constitution Alive class. That's how I met you. And I was a political science student and very much a history student, even in high school. And I thought I did a pretty good job of learning about the Constitution and various things, but I found how little I really knew once I started teaching these classes. And I find that, if my knowledge is that lacking and it's something that I'm very passionate about, and my discussions with other people is that they don't have that understanding either, that it's hard to get into the details and hard to really dig deep when most people just kind of need an umbrella. Here, let me see the big picture. And then if I'm interested, I can dig into the Roman civilization, Greek civilizations, different things, and learn more details about them. I'm also a educator. I work more on the corporate side of things. And that approach has really worked with me in corporate training. I'm sure, we talk about, what's your desired outcome for sharing the book. Totally respect and appreciate that we want to pass our blessings that we believe we have from the country we live in onto future generations. So kind of a little bit beyond that, if somebody were to read your book, what kind of takeaways would you hope they would take as action steps to do something based on what they've learned?
First thing that I would hope that they would take away would be that a lot of what is taught today in the public schools is, I won't say it's not true. I'll just say that it's not the whole story. Many of the things that we're taught, and of course, I am also a district captain in the Convention of States program action. And one of the things that we're taught, in particularly about American government, is that the convention in 1787 was a runaway convention, that they were supposed to somehow amend the Articles of Confederation, and they walked in and closed the door and threw the Articles of Confederation out the window. That is a progressive myth. If you read the instructions that were given from each of the states to the people that went to that convention, with the exception of 2 states, it doesn't even mention the Articles of Confederation. It just says, come up with something that's going to work, because it doesn't work right. So there's a lot of things like that are being taught that are not necessarily the straight dope. And so my hope is that by reading my book, that they will see some of those things, and the takeaway would be, oh, the ideas that they came up with were good ideas, and maybe we should stick with them. Electoral college was a good idea. The fact that the Constitution itself deals with the whole country rather than every individual thing that governments might be involved in, that the states had a real function at a local and state level that the founding fathers didn't want the federal government to be involved in. They thought it was better that the states were taking care of those things. Stuff like that, I would hope that they would come away with a better understanding of the civics of the founding to be available to them. Now, as far as actions, the last chapter, I talk about things that I think need to be done to make this country, put it back on course. Things that, like, we need to do something to strengthen the family. Our government has done a lot of things that, at the federal level, they've done a lot of things that have really weakened the family. Our whole welfare program is, if you read Thomas Sowell or Walter Williams, the 2 economists that are my favorites, they'll tell you that in the 1960s, we instituted programs at the federal government level that have really weakened the family. For whatever reason, several decades ago, a guy named Justice Black, who was a member of the Supreme Court, said, well, there's a big separation between church and state, so you can't teach scripture in the schools, you can't pray in the schools, you can't do anything in the schools. And this whole separation of church and state has weakened the religious foundations of our country. We need to try and figure that out and get the spiritual back into the community, because without the spiritual, most of our founding fathers said, hey, this government isn't made for people that are atheists or immoral. It's made for people who are religious and who are moral and who accept these Judeo-Christian values that are taught in the churches. So we need to try and reinvigorate the family, reinvigorate the religion in our family, have a revival, national revival. We did that through the 1800s. Periodically, they had national revivals that rekindled our Christian beliefs. And we need to go back to some of the things that the Constitution, the original Constitution, not the one that we look at today. And the reason I make the distinguish between those is because the original Constitution is a very thin book. And the Constitution that we operate from today is about 3 inches thick, thousands of pages of case law and everything, much of which varies from the Constitution. We've reinterpreted, we've left it behind. And so the idea would be to get back to the basics that the founding fathers put us in. 17th Amendment basically made the Senate nothing more than an upper house of representatives, because it's all by the people, and they took the states totally out of the equation. Those are things that were wrong.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's interesting. I think people underestimate the power of the administrative state and all of these federal agencies. They were not included in our original Constitution. And it's not to say that we shouldn't have any of them, but in my opinion, they should be very limited in scope, because unless you've been impacted directly by some of these large organizations, the IRS, everybody's impacted by that one, is you don't recognize that the power that they have. Number one, you never gave them that power. I think that's the beauty of our Constitution, is the power resides in the people, and the people loan that power to the government, and they should be able to take it back at any given point in time, even, the 17th Amendment kind of thing. But once these administrative organizations, we'll call them three-letter agencies, take on that power, you have to go through the Supreme Court. Sometimes the Supreme Court will side with you, sometimes they won't. It's a very long process. And in that process, people are really negatively impacted. Now, that's not to say that some of the, that they do everything they do is bad, but you have to weigh it and say, okay, and the administrative state has grown and grown and grown and grown. And we as individuals don't have any say in what these agencies do. Whereas to some degree, we can, I think we've kind of neutered ourselves over the years, but we're supposed to be able to affect what happens in Congress because we vote. Well, we have no vote in these administrative organizations. And I find it really interesting because there's just this whole, I don't want to get too political, but this whole argument with Trump and his classified documents. And one of the most interesting arguments that I think comes out of it, basically, if the courts side with the people who say that he didn't have the right to declassify this information, you've basically taken a huge, huge power away from the president. And you've now said that, okay, these agencies are the ones that decide what's classified and not classified. And people are like, well, that sounds good. Why would we put all of that power in one person? And my own personal opinion, and it's something, we'd have to have a much larger conversation about, this is very high level, is that whenever you have any type of organization, there needs to be some kind of hierarchical structure. And our founding fathers believed that. That's why they believed in an executive branch. But they also had checks and balances, to make sure that that person didn't get too much power. But somebody needs to decide, it's way too slow, way too cumbersome to, what is it called when you dictate by committee, Can you imagine trying to declassify literally tens of thousands of documents? And one person says we should, one person says we shouldn't, one wants to, mark this part out. It would just be insane. Whereas we have said in the past that we have entrusted our president, our executive branch with, that's why we put him into office, and we said, we trust you to manage that process and to decide what should be classified and not. So once again, it's just another example of somebody coming in and saying, hey, we're taking all this power away from the president, which I don't think the president should be all powerful. And I remember, growing up, I didn't come from a political family at all, but the one thing I remember my mom saying to me is, we need more power at the local level. And because we have outsourced so much power to the federal government, most people don't even understand. And Roe v. Wade was one that really, really drove this point home. Most people don't understand what states' rights are. They did to them when Roe v. Wade got overturned. It's like, oh, we can no longer have abortions. And it took them a long time to figure out that, oh, this just means it's going back to the states. And, I prefer most things done at the local level because I can affect more change at the local level than I can in Washington, D.C.
Well, not only that, but the people in Washington, D.C. are in Washington, D.C. And, I live just outside the Beltway, but I'll tell you, my experience has been that the people who live inside the Beltway, there's a wall around Washington, D.C. that's sort of the Beltway. And if that wall went all the way to heaven, it would probably, that would be the picture that you could see because they don't see anything outside of that wall. You've got people at the Department of Agriculture, which is located in downtown Washington, D.C., that are making decisions about agriculture that's on the other side of the Mississippi River, 1,600 miles away, and they have no idea what's going on over there. So you're absolutely right. And when the founding fathers put this whole thing together, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is very limited in what the federal government is supposed to do. There are 17 things there that the federal government is supposed to do. And those things are things that affect the whole country. They're not parochial in their definition. Things like foreign affairs and having wars and stuff like that generally affect the whole country. That's the 17 things that are listed. Everything else is supposed to be at the state level or at the local level. And the 10th Amendment to the Constitution is very clear about that. If it's not listed in those 17 things, then it either belongs to the states or to the people. Somehow or another, over the last 200 years, we've managed to corrupt that definition with a couple of different things that are in the Constitution that people have misread, misinterpreted. The Commerce Clause being one of them, and the Necessary and Proper Clause being the other. Those two clauses are totally misused for the last 100 years. And then we end up with things like the Department of Education, which is not in one of those 17 things. Department of Agriculture is not one of those 17 things. And you can list probably a half a dozen agencies, plus the ones that get me are NPR, National Public Radio. Now, where in the Constitution does it talk about the United States federal government having a propaganda arm? I could go on for a long time about this because I'm kind of passionate about it. We've stripped the local, state, and government city powers, stripped them away, and handed them to people in Washington that can't see outside the Beltway. And that's scary because that means that the power is in that little cone that goes up above Washington, D.C., and the power outside of that is diminishing.
Yeah, I find it interesting because I think that a lot of people like the fact that the power lies in the federal system, not realizing how much it basically neuters us as individuals and takes away our own power. I think a lot of people sometimes don't want that power because they feel like it's too much responsibility. They have to pay too close attention to things. They have to be more involved, and they don't want to. It's easier just once every 2 or 4 years to go check a box, vote for somebody, that for the last month I've paid attention to the election, the elections, and heard a lot of good ads. These ads sound really good. I was listening to something yesterday that I thought was really interesting. And it explained, I was like, how do people, and I don't mean to pick on John Fetterman, but I'll pick on John Fetterman. Or I'll pick on Katie Hobbs in Arizona, or even Joe Biden. I mean, seriously, how do people that are so completely and totally detached from reality and incompetent get into office? And they said basically what they do is this micro-targeting because of Facebook and all of these, social media platforms, and they've sold your data to the federal government. They go in and they gather all this data and they say, okay, Roe v. Wade, that's what they did in the 2022 election. So the election became all about Roe v. Wade. And they found all the people that were not likely to vote, but they knew based on their, social media, profiles that they were passionate about Roe v. Wade. So they bring a ballot to their door and they'd say, vote for John Fetterman because he did not support overturning Roe v. Wade. They walk them to their mailbox, have them put it in the mailbox. And I mean, there's a whole lot of other things. I don't want to get into the whole election integrity thing, but this whole micro-targeting thing was really fascinating to me. So I think we have a lot of people who it's like, okay, I voted, and I'm a single issue voter. I don't want to be educated about all of these different issues. I did my civic duty, and I'm like, I honestly believe, and I had a conversation back in the early 80s with somebody very close to me, and I was always very politically minded and very passionate. I was like, oh, we need to be involved. We need to vote, blah, blah, blah. And they were like, oh, that's just too much work. Don't worry, I can't. And my vote doesn't matter anyway, kind of thing. And I was just like, ah. So if I had one takeaway that I think from this conversation with you is that I think people need to recognize that with the great blessings of this Constitution also comes tremendous responsibility.
Yes, and we don't teach that in school.
No.
We do not teach it. And that's one of the problems that I had when I was teaching. They hand you a book and say, okay, this is the book that the kids have to read over the summer on the Constitution, a constitutional convention. And so you go through the book and you discover that it's just not what they should be reading. I mean, a lot of the information in there is blatantly false. And but that's what they hand you to give, and you give it out. And the same thing with a lot of the other stuff that I thought we were supposed to be teaching, and it just wasn't in the material. So that's one of the reasons I left teaching. And quite frankly, I contacted a homeschooling co-op in Manassas and was going to teach for them. The problem was that the course I put together apparently didn't intrigue the students enough, so I only had one student sign up for the program, and so I didn't teach. But I'm still in contact with them, and I'm still going to do a Constitution thing with them in September. And I'm hoping I can get the public school that I taught at to have me come in and do the Constitution coach kind of stuff for Constitution Week in September.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Not only should we be civic minded and pay attention to our elections, but pay attention to our local elections, get more involved in our school boards, find out what's being taught. And I will admit, if I've had history classes where it's nothing more than names and dates and, that type of thing, that's boring. Here's a Constitution, read the Constitution. Okay, that's boring. But in our Constitutional Live class that we have, I think Rick Green does a tremendous job of making it somewhat more relatable and much more interesting. And I think that's what we need to do is, we need to bring back that lively discussion. And it's like, let's not just talk about Article 1, Section 3, let's discuss what it means in your life today and how it impacts you. So if we could, that part on education, and as parents, we need to take a more active role in our children's lives. If we don't, the schools and the government will, and then we will no longer have the blessing of raising our own children,
Well, that's what the government would like to see happen.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I say. If we don't, take a more active role in making sure that we are parenting our children. And, my kids all went to public school growing up, and I was kind of on the fence about it even back then. But now I'm like, I would homeschool my kids. I don't trust the schools to teach my children accurate information. And I don't just mean history. There are so many things that I just think it's not their responsibility to be teaching my kids. But once again, it goes back to the idea that with great blessings come great responsibility. We can't just outsource our kids to the education system anymore. We can't just say, it's nice to go to church once in a while, maybe Easter, Christmas. I don't care what religion you belong to, but I think having a moral compass, is helpful. This idea that, my truth is my truth, your truth is your truth. Well, seriously, how it takes 5 minutes of critical thinking to say that's dumb.
Exactly. And one of the things that I try to point out in the books is that the virtues that the founding fathers thought were necessary virtues for a population to survive in the republic that they built. I talk about the four cardinal virtues, which, as a Freemason, those are important in the life of a Freemason. So you end up with temperance, prudence, fortitude, and justice. Those things are important. And the other thing is having a sense of responsibility, a sense of duty. We have obligations as citizens that we have to perform, or the country goes down the tubes.
Mm-hmm.
And fiscal responsibility is part of that. In our families, well, in most families, you don't spend more money than you have or can justifiably earn. Unfortunately, our government doesn't see it that way. They seem to think that they can spend our money any way they want to and borrow and pass that on to us. And they talk about the national debt, which right now is close to $32 trillion, but they don't talk necessarily about the unfunded liabilities that we have, which are $172 trillion. So that's one of the things that I have a great fear about. And another reason why I wrote this book is because I want people to start looking at this and saying, hey, we can't do this indefinitely. Eventually, the bill's going to have to come due, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to pay it.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think that's a kind of a good note to end on is, we need to, be more civically minded and take a more active role in what goes on in our country. And, part of that is, looking at the amount of money that our government spends. Just because they have a printing press and just because it hasn't come home to roost yet, people don't realize that every time your taxes go up by a small percentage, it's because they need that money to pay, so you don't think it's impacting you. This inflation, all of these things are a direct result of what our federal government is doing financially. So between inflation and increase in taxes, it is impacting you. And even though many of us can still afford it, it hasn't bankrupted me yet, that doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. And that's where your truth and my truth need to come together. We need to have one truth and come to an understanding of, I don't think we need to agree on everything, but I think there needs to be some basic truths defined that we all need to agree on. And to do that, we need to have conversations.
Well, hopefully I'm going to be very positive about this. Hopefully once the book is published, that it will create conversation. And if that happens, that would be great for me. I don't care whether I make any money on it or not, as long as people are looking at it and it's creating some kind of civic responsibility in people's lives.
Yes, and I'm with you. I've published a few books and I'm on the same page. And I think a lot of people who've written books nowadays kind of, have the same idea. It's like, we just need to get information out there to people. People need to be more educated. That's one way to educate yourself. And we need to have conversations. And these conversations don't need to be confrontational. They don't need to be argumentative. It's just simply, I'll listen to you. And I mean, truly listen to you. But in return, I hope you'll listen to me and truly listen to me so that we can have a conversation and hopefully come to some solutions, because I'm with you. I want to be optimistic. I want to say that we can solve these problems. But I think, going back to our original discussion, we need to look back in history to see how it was done before so that we have a blueprint for moving forward.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for your time today. And I look forward to getting your book when it's published.
Well, I'll keep in touch with you and let you know what Chris and I come up with on Saturday.
All righty, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.